Hello everyone, welcome to our Bible book overview series. Before we begin reading each book of the Bible, we want to take a little time to understand its background, setting and main message so that our reading becomes clearer, richer and more meaningful. Our hope is that when we open Scripture, we will not only understand the words on the page, but also come with greater expectation and a heart ready to meet God through His Word. Today we are going to talk about the Book of Esther. To enter this book, imagine this scene. God's people are not living in Jerusalem, and they are not gathered in the temple for worship. They are scattered throughout the vast Persian Empire. They are living in a foreign land, far away from what feels familiar. Their identity is complicated, and their future feels uncertain. Even more striking, the Book of Esther never directly mentions the name of God. It does not directly mention prayer, the temple, or the law. On the surface, it may seem like a book without obvious spiritual language. But as you read the whole story, you begin to realize something remarkable. God is never named, but His hand is everywhere. One of the most famous lines in the book is what Mordecai says to Esther. "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" That sentence is one of the keys to the whole book. It reminds us that our position, timing, and opportunities are often not accidental. God may place someone in a specific position at a specific moment in order to accomplish His purpose through them. If Exodus shows us God saving His people through visible power, through the Red Sea, fire, and mighty miracles, Esther shows us another kind of deliverance. Here, God works through an unseen hand, quietly moving through palace politics, timing, danger, human choices, and what appear to be coincidences in order to protect His people. So, if we were to summarize the Book of Esther in one sentence, we could say this. Esther shows us that when God's people face a deadly crisis in a foreign land, God may seem hidden, but He is still at work through human position, timing, courage, and obedience to preserve His people and bring about deliverance. Before we begin reading Esther, there are two important reading lenses we need to put on. The first is to notice the hidden God in this book. Esther is one of the most unusual books in the Bible because the words God or the Lord never appear directly in the story. There are no obvious miracles, no public prayers, no temple scenes, and no direct reading of the law. But that does not mean God is absent. In fact, that is one of the most brilliant and profound features of the book. The author does not say directly, God did this. Instead, we are invited to see God's hidden hand in every turn of the story, every coincidence, and every perfectly timed detail. Vashti is removed, making room for Esther to enter the palace. Mordecai happens to overhear a plot to assassinate the king. That event is recorded in the royal chronicles, but Mordecai is not rewarded at the time. Later, the king happens to be unable to sleep on the most important night, and the record that happens to be read is the one about Mordecai saving the king's life. Each of these details may look like coincidence if viewed alone, but when they are placed together, they form an invisible thread that leads the story toward deliverance. Esther reminds us that in ordinary days, in silent seasons, and in moments when we cannot see obvious miracles, God is still ruling behind the scenes. The second lens is to recognize the ancient conflict behind Haman and Mordecai. On the surface, Esther tells the story of Haman's hatred toward Mordecai and his plan to destroy the Jews. But if we know the Old Testament background, we can see an even deeper historical thread. Haman is called an Agagite, which likely connects him to Agag, the Amalekite king from the days of Saul. The Amalekites had attacked Israel after the Exodus, and God had declared ongoing judgment against Amalek. Mordecai, on the other hand, is a Benjaminite, connected to the same tribal line as King Saul. So Haman's hatred of the Jews is not merely personal revenge because his pride has been wounded. It reflects a much older conflict. It reminds us that the danger facing God's people in Esther is not only political, it is also connected to the survival of God's covenant people and the continuation of God's redemptive plan. Now we can ask another basic question. Who wrote the Book of Esther? Traditionally, some have associated the book with Mordecai himself, or with a Jewish scribe from the same period who was familiar with the Persian court. The book gives very detailed descriptions of Persian royal customs, banquets, decrees, official records, and palace life. This suggests that the author knew the Persian setting well. King Ahasuerus is usually identified with Xerxes I, who reigned from about 486 to 465 BC. The story takes place during the height of the Persian Empire, when the Jewish people were living as a vulnerable minority scattered among the nations. One major purpose of the book is to explain the origin of the Jewish festival of Purim. The word Purim comes from the casting of lots, because Haman used lots to choose the day when the Jews would be destroyed. But God turned that day of destruction into a day of deliverance and victory, so that the Jewish people would remember his preservation from generation to generation. So Esther is not merely a palace story, and it is not merely a record of a national crisis. It is a word of comfort to God's scattered people. Even when you are far from Jerusalem, even when you cannot see obvious miracles, even when the situation is dangerous and complex, God has not left you. He is still watching over his people, and he can still overturn the situation. Now let's look at the structure of Esther. The structure of the book is carefully designed, almost like a suspenseful drama. Many details that appear early in the story later become the key to the great reversal. The first section, chapters 1 to 2, introduces the hidden crisis and the rise of the queen. The book begins with King Ahasuerus holding a great feast. During the banquet, he commands Queen Vashti to appear and display her beauty, but Vashti refuses. In anger, the king removes her from being queen. On the surface, this looks like a royal scandal. But in the larger story, this event prepares the way for Esther to enter the palace. Then Esther appears. She is a Jewish orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. When the king searches throughout the empire for a new queen, Esther is taken into the palace, gains the king's favor, and becomes queen. Following Mordecai's instruction, she does not reveal her Jewish identity at first. Chapter 2 also plants another important seed. Mordecai, while sitting at the king's gate, happens to hear about a plot by two officials to assassinate the king. He tells Esther, Esther reports it to the king, and the king is saved. This event is written in the royal chronicles, but Mordecai receives no reward at the time. That forgotten act of faithfulness will later become one of the most important turning points in the whole book. The second section, chapters 3 and 4, presents the plot of destruction and Esther's decision. In chapter 3, Haman is promoted to a high position. The king's servants bow down before him, but Mordecai refuses. Haman becomes furious, but he is not satisfied with punishing Mordecai alone. He decides to destroy all the Jews throughout the empire. By casting lots, Purim, he chooses a day for their destruction and deceives the king into approving the decree. When the decree goes out, the Jewish people throughout the empire are thrown into mourning, fasting, weeping, and lament. Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes and goes to the king's gate. He urges Esther to go before the king and plead for her people. But Esther knows how dangerous this is. According to Persian royal protocol, anyone who enters the inner court without being summoned can be put to death, unless the king extends the golden scepter. Esther has not been called to the king for 30 days. She does not know what will happen if she goes in. It is at this moment that Mordecai says the famous words, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther is brought to a decision. She can no longer view her royal position only as personal security. She must consider whether God has placed her there for this very moment. Finally, Esther decides. She asks Mordecai to gather all the Jews in Susa to fast for her for 3 days and 3 nights. Then she will go to the king, even though it is against the law. She says, "If I perish, I perish." This is not courage without fear. It is obedience and responsibility in the middle of fear. The third section, chapters 5 to 8, brings us to the great reversal. Esther risks her life and comes before the king. The king extends the golden scepter to her, but Esther does not immediately expose Haman's plot. Instead, she wisely invites the king and Haman to a banquet. After the first banquet, she invites them to come again the next day. Meanwhile, Haman becomes more and more proud. He is delighted that the queen has invited him to a private banquet with the king. But when he sees Mordecai still refusing to bow before him, he is filled with anger. His family and friends advise him to build a tall gallows and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then comes the great turning point of the book. That night the king could not sleep. The sentence sounds ordinary, but it changes everything. Since the king cannot sleep, he asks for the royal chronicles to be read to him. The very section they read is the record of Mordecai exposing the assassination plot and saving the king's life. The king asks, "What honor or distinction has been given to Mordecai for this?" The answer is, nothing. The next morning, Haman enters the court, intending to ask for Mordecai's death. But before he can speak, the king asks him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman assumes the king is talking about him, so he describes an extravagant public honor: royal robes, the king's horse, and a noble official leading the man through the city, proclaiming that this is how the king honors the one he delights in. Then the king commands Haman to do exactly that for Mordecai. The irony is powerful. Haman planned to humiliate and kill Mordecai, but instead he is forced to lead Mordecai through the city in honor. God does not send thunder from heaven. He works through one sleepless night, one royal record, and one question from the king to turn the entire situation around. At the second banquet, Esther finally reveals her identity and exposes Haman's plot. The king is furious, and Haman is hanged on the very gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. The trap Haman dug for another becomes the place of his own judgment. The fourth section, chapters 9 and 10, records victory, deliverance, and the establishment of Purim. Because a Persian royal decree could not be revoked, the king issues a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves on the day they were meant to be destroyed. That day, which was supposed to be a day of extinction, becomes a day of victory and deliverance. The Jewish people then established the festival of Purim, a yearly celebration to remember how sorrow was turned into joy, mourning into gladness, and death into deliverance. Before you begin reading the Book of Esther, pay special attention to a few things. First, pay attention to God's hidden providence. This book does not directly describe God speaking or performing visible miracles, but the whole story shows us that God does not always work in obvious ways. He can quietly and precisely move through palace politics, crisis, timing, sleepless nights, and what appear to be coincidences. Vashti is removed. Esther enters the palace. Mordecai hears of a plot. His service is recorded but not immediately rewarded. The king cannot sleep on the crucial night. The royal chronicles are opened to exactly the right page. These details may look like coincidence by themselves, but together they reveal the hidden providence of God. They remind us that when we cannot see miracles, it does not mean God is absent. He is still able to weave his deliverance through the ordinary events of life. Second, pay attention to the book's carefully crafted reversals. Esther is full of irony and contrast. The gallows Haman builds for Mordecai becomes the place of Haman's own death. The day Haman chooses by lot for Jewish destruction becomes the day of Jewish victory. Haman thinks he will be honored on the king's horse, but instead he must lead Mordecai through the city. These reversals are not only literary beauty. They show us that human beings may think they control the situation, but in God's hands, the trap of the wicked can become their own downfall, and the most dangerous crisis can become the turning point of deliverance. Third, pay attention to identity. Esther hides her Jewish identity at first, but later she must stand openly with her people. Mordecai's refusal to bow before Haman also shows a kind of refusal to compromise identity at a critical moment. True identity is not merely a label we carry when life is safe. It is revealed under pressure and cost. Fourth, pay attention to timing, and such a time as this. Many of the turning points in Esther depend on timing. When to speak, when to wait, when to act, and when to fast. Esther could have stayed hidden in the palace and tried to protect herself. But Mordecai's words remind her that her royal position may not have been given merely for her own comfort, but for the moment when her people were in danger. This challenges us to ask, has God placed me in my current position, with my relationships, resources, and opportunities, for a purpose? Am I willing in a critical moment not only to protect myself, but to respond to the responsibility God has given me. Fifth, pay attention to courage and cost. Esther finally steps forward not because she is fearless, but because she entrusts her safety to God. True courage is often not the absence of fear. It is choosing obedience in the middle of fear. After reading the Book of Esther, here are a few questions we can reflect on. When you think about all the coincidences in the story, ask yourself, in my own life, could some seemingly accidental meetings, opportunities, delays, or setbacks also carry God's hidden guidance? Do I believe that even in ordinary, dark, or silent seasons, God is still working behind the scenes? When you hear the phrase, "for such a time as this," ask yourself, are my current identity, position, gifts, relationships, and resources only for my own safety and comfort? Or could God be calling me to help someone, carry responsibility, or respond faithfully in an important moment? When you hear Esther say, "If I perish, I perish," ask yourself, when I face issues of truth, conscience, faith, or major challenges in life, am I willing to entrust the outcome to God and still choose what is right? When you read that the king could not sleep that night, ask yourself, when I see the wicked prospering, the righteous being pressured, and situations that seem to have no way out, am I still willing to wait for God's turning point? Do I believe that God can use even one sleepless night to change the entire situation? Here is one helpful reading tip. Read Esther like a complete story, ideally in one sitting. The whole book is not very long and can often be read in about 20 minutes. Reading it straight through will help you feel the tension, foreshadowing, irony, and reversal of the story. You will see more clearly how the author slowly leads proud Haman into the very trap he prepared for someone else. Dear brothers and sisters, if you are about to begin reading the Book of Esther, do not treat it only as an exciting palace story. It certainly has suspense, political tension, a courageous queen, and a stunning reversal. But at a deeper level, it shows us that even when God seems silent, he has not left his people. The situation may appear to be controlled by kings, officials, decrees, and systems, but the true Lord of history is still the hidden and faithful God. This book also reminds us that a person's position is often not accidental. Esther was placed in the role of queen not simply for her own safety or honor, but so that she might become an instrument in God's hand at a crucial moment. God may also place us in a particular family, workplace, community, relationship, or season so that we can respond to him in our own such a time as this. May you, as you read Esther, not only see Esther's courage, Mordecai's faithfulness, Haman's downfall, and the deliverance of the Jews, but come to know more deeply the God who rules in hiddenness, protects in silence, and accomplishes his purpose even in crisis. May you not only be moved by the story, but also ask yourself, has God placed me where I am today for his timing and his purpose? And may this book remind you again that when you cannot see God, it does not mean he is not at work. Thank you for watching today's episode of our Bible Book Overview series. If this series helps you understand Scripture more clearly, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you in the next episode.